Good afternoon, everyone. I love it when you say it back. I introduced like a few of these lectures, and it's always like I feel like a proud teacher in a classroom. I see a couple of people are still getting seated, but we're just about ready to get started. So my name is Lauren Wright, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to this lecture for our new exhibition, Threaded Visions, Contemporary Weavings from the Collection. Before we begin, I want to ask you all to please silence your cell phones. I work in interpretation, where we work alongside curators to tell interesting and accessible stories about works of art. Over the past few months, I've worked with textiles curator Melinda Watt to figure out the best way to share 15 incredible weavings from the collection with you, our visitors. The resulting exhibition balances information about the artist, the material, and the story that each weaving is telling, with information about technique, which you'll learn more about today. This afternoon, Melinda Watt will join Anna Burckhardt, an architecture and design curator, to discuss what weaving is and how it works. Melinda Watt, chair, and Christa C. Thurman Curator of Textiles, is the curator of Threaded Visions, Contemporary Weavings from the Collection. Watt has led textiles at the Art Institute since 2018. Her previous exhibitions include Geoswaby, Fresh Up, Fabricating Fashion, and Morris & Company, The Business of Beauty, at the Art Institute of Chicago, as well as Interwoven Globe, the worldwide textile trade, 1500 to 1800, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Anna Burckhardt is the Neville Bryan Assistant Curator of Architecture and Design at the Art Institute. Before joining us, she worked at the Museum of Modern Art, where she organized and co-organized several exhibitions and programs, most recently Projects, Carolina Quesero and David de Rosas. She's the curator of the upcoming exhibition Threads to the South, which will open at the Institute for Studies on Latin American Art, New York, in March 2024, so this month. Please join me in welcoming Melinda Watt and Anna Burckhardt.
Are we on? Yes, we are. Thank you very much to Lauren for the introduction. As Lauren said, she was she was the interpretive lead on this project and really an essential partner in making the show what it is you see today. So I just want to thank Anna for agreeing to join me today too, to share some of the conversations that she and I have had over the past year or so since she joined the Art Institute. We've been talking a lot about fiber arts, about textiles, about the themes that are literally common threads between the works in architecture and design and the textile department. We've developed a really fruitful dialogue, and we're looking forward to sharing some of that with you. First, I'm going to give you a short virtual walkthrough of the show and the sections that I've defined as the project unfolded. And then Anna and I will discuss how the creation of textiles can really explore both personal cultural identities as well as honor foreign textile practices. We'll look at a selection of works in greater depth and in conjunction with other works that we feel will help contextualize the works for you and resonate with the art. So, one of the common denominators among the artistic practices of the weavers that we'll discuss today is this reverence and deep knowledge for the history of textiles and the history of textile technologies and materials. For myself, as a curator whose practice is also rooted in historical textiles, identifying artists who work in this way and whose practice is based in the study of their predecessors has really been an essential factor in my curatorial decision-making process. The Art Institute is really fortunate to have one of the best modern contemporary textile collections in the United States. And so while this is an opportunity to show 3 new acquisitions, it's also an opportunity, again, to highlight acquisitions that have been made by my predecessors. So knowledge and respect for materials really allows each artist to make an informed decision about what to use and how to use it. Some carefully deploy color and spacing for visual impact. Some use diverse materials, experimenting with different technologies. Here you see the first gallery of the show, where we have works by a new acquisition by Eduardo Portillo and Maria Davila called White Dwarf. We have a work by Olga Amaral, who is really one of the most revered textile artists working in fiber in the world today, and a work by James Bassler, an American artist who is less well known, but is one of the people we really want to highlight in terms of his deep knowledge about global textile techniques. Moving into the second space, we're really looking at having a conversation about translucency versus opacity. So you'll see the red work is by a British artist named Peter Collingwood, who has done an exploration of the weaving technology known as gauze, or the technique known as gauze. This work is composed of red-orange threads that are really about the size of a sewing thread, and they're only held together by about 10 different wefts along the over 6-foot length. So he's taken an idea about a technique, the crossing and recrossing of weft threads that has been done for thousands of years, and he's really pushed it as far as it could possibly go into this kind of somewhere between a sculpture and a diagram. Next to Peter Collingwood is the work of Chicago artist Dorothy Hughes, who has really kind of taken the opposite approach in terms of using very heavy-looking, very kind of furry materials in her woven strips that are composed of tapestry techniques, so a weft-faced, very close weave. And it has this wonderful sort of earthy quality to it, where it is completely opaque. One can't see through it at all. Opposite Dorothy Hughes and Peter Collingwood, we have the work of two very different artists. Shigeo Kubota is the small, colorful work that you see on the one side, and then Olga Amaral's fantastic Entorno Quieto Senko, which Anna will talk about in more detail in a couple of minutes. These artists are both working with strips, small strips of weaving that they have deployed in completely different ways. Kubota has taken them and mounted them very carefully and twisted them and manipulated them, whereas the more than 200 strips in Amaral's works are left to hang free, but the effect is really magical, as Anna will talk about later. So I won't talk any more about that now. We move into the third small section of the exhibition, which we've called Color First, where we're looking at the work of artists who, rather than patterning during the weaving process, a lot of the patterning is happening before any weaving happens. In other words, they are coloring the threads, and it's all about color, the process that we know as ikat traditionally, which developed in the Middle and Far East, is a process where individual threads or groups of threads are dyed first, then put onto a loom, and the pattern reveals itself. So you can imagine the careful planning that has to go into this kind of process. It is a process that we see here, executed by an American artist named Michael Rode on the left-hand side, and by a British artist, a primarily watercolorist named Audrey Brockbank. But it is for weavers and people working in fiber. The ikat dyeing technique is one that is just endlessly fascinating. In the last section of the exhibition, we're really exploring mechanical patterning. and advanced patterning. So we have the work of Ethel Stein, who is really known as a kind of weaver's weaver among this group of artists and among people who are working in fiber in America. The Art Institute actually did a monographic exhibition of Stein's work in 2011, which some of you may remember. That was before my time, but we're lucky to have a very large collection of Stein's work. In the work that is shown in this image, she has developed her own loom to do advanced patterning, but it is still all done by hand. On the other side, next to her, is the work of an artist named Leah Cook, who is using what's called a jacquard mechanism, a mechanical patterning mechanism, but she's still hand weaving. So the patterning is pre-programmed, but Cook is controlling the weaving as it happens. And I'll talk a bit more about her later. And then the last three works in this last room of the exhibition, we have Cynthia Shira, a kind of quilt-like composition that she has also done on a mechanical jacquard mechanism, mechanical jacquard loom. Qualisha Wood, an acquisition which we just finalized last month, which is very exciting. A really exciting young artist who is working with digital patterning, completely digital weaving. And then the great Junichi Arai, who was a Japanese weaving innovator who did just amazing things with mechanical techniques. So that's the exhibition in short. Now we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about some of the works in the exhibition. And again, I'm so delighted, I can't tell you how delighted I am to introduce all of you to the work of Maria Davila and Eduardo Portillo. We acquired their work called White Dwarf, again, just last year through the support, and I want to give a shout out to our wonderful departmental supporter, Nicole Williams, who has been, through the tenure of my predecessors and my tenure, really one of the biggest supporters of contemporary weaving for our department. Eduardo and Maria created this work called White Dwarf. Some of you may be familiar with the White Dwarf star, this phenomenon of a star that has come to the end of its life, and it's glowing very hot and white before it collapses on itself. The Portillos they are a couple who are also really admired for their excellence in weaving, but also for their poetic vision. They're in conversations with their dealer, the dealer told me that the other artists he represents actually acquire the Portillo's work because they are so enamored of their skill and their vision. Here you're able to see a combination of fibers that the Portillos use. They have traveled widely. They have traveled to China to study sericulture, that is the raising of silkworms. They have traveled to India to study the processing of indigo and to study traditional weaving techniques there. They have gone back to their home in Venezuela and have also started to experiment with fibers that are regional or local. So here in White Dwarf, we have a combination of silk that they have grown and processed. I have with alpaca, which is, as you know, a South American camelid animal, which for centuries has been grown for its very, very, very fine fleece, which has this lovely dark matte finish to it when it's dyed. We have metal threads, which I have to say are impossible to photograph, so you have to go see the work for yourself because it's just lovely, glowing, shiny. And then we have these really rough moriche palm fibers, which is a local fiber that is used in Venezuela mostly for very practical objects like hammocks and bags and baskets. So the Portillos have put these four very different types of materials together. And again, images belie the actual very dimensional nature of the piece. But they just have this amazing ability to put these things together. And just a last illustration here of some of the Portillo's projects. This is a model sericulture house, a house for silkworms. And you can see, actually I'll try to use the pointer. You can see, so here's a sort of faux tree that the silkworms are growing on. Here are the worms themselves. They're starting to make their cocoons. Here are the mulberry leaves, which are necessary to feed the silkworms, and here are some cocoons complete. The silkworms, I have to say, are incredibly picky eaters. They will only eat the white mulberry leaves. So this is both a labor of love on the part of the Portillos, but also very much a part of their practice. And I show you this just to indicate the depth of their dedication to every aspect of what they do. So I'm going to turn it over to Anna now, and she's going to talk about the work of Olga Amaral, again, another superstar in the fiber world.
Thank you so much, Melinda. It's such a pleasure to be here with you, and thank you everybody for coming. And thank you for introducing that beautiful work. When Melinda first approached me about joining her in this for this event, we thought it would be really interesting to focus on ideas of identity and identification through the use of materials and particular techniques. And I really think that this piece is the very best way to start the talk and focus it on that. But I want to also highlight some of those themes in the work of Olga Amaral. I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with Olga's work. She is one of the sort of most recognized fiber artists from Latin America and also, I would say, internationally. And this particular piece, which is from 1983, is called Alquimia 3, and it's part of one of her largest, if not her largest, body of work called Alquimia, and it's the series in which she really began to engage with gold and gold leaf as a material. I wanted to sort of focus on the reasons why she's looking at gold and how that might also speak a little bit to her sort of identification as a Latin American and Colombian artist that is also working in an international sort of lineage of fiber art. And so Alquimia in particular refers to the sort of pseudoscientific process of turning cheap metals into gold. When Olga Amaral first started sort of looking at this or working in this particular series, she wasn't necessarily looking to work with gold at the beginning. She first started to work with gesso, which interestingly sort of like took her pieces more into the realm of paintings that she had ever been in before. I'll talk about this a bit more about this a little bit later, but she was very much sort of like engaged in organic materials to this point. But the 80s really marked a sort of like a period of transformation and experimentation for Olga Amaral. And so once she started incorporating gesso into her textile pieces, she realized that that was a perfect canvas to introduce gold leaf. You can see a little bit more here in this sort of close-up. And what's really interesting about Olga's use of gold is that she very openly says that she started using it and continues to use it to this day merely for formal properties and as a way to allow her to sort of like engage with light displays and sort of transparencies and opacities. But she was also inspired by sort of global craft techniques of particularly kintsugi, which is the sort of practice of mending or repairing ceramics using gold leaf as a way to sort of highlight imperfections. And so again, we're sort of seeing her engage with these sort of like global, really, really ancient techniques that are part of sort of like craft heritage that a lot of artists are looking into. But she's also very much interested, you can see here an example of kintsugi. And what's interesting about this particular work is that it's actually from China, even though kintsugi is a Japanese technique. As I was learning a little bit more about the piece, I also learned that kintsugi became really prevalent in other areas of East Asia, particularly in China. And that also speaks to these sort of like very interesting I guess, networks of exchange around materials and practices that we really want to highlight in this presentation. But again, Olga is very much rooted in her own sort of like particular vernacular as a Colombian artist. And she is looking at gold, not necessarily as sort of commentary on colonial legacies, but she's interested in sort of like interlaced colonial histories around gold, particularly in relation to gold religious uses, both in pre-Columbian times and during colonial Spanish times. This particular piece that I wanted to sort of highlight as an example is called the Muisca Raft. It was made by the Muisca indigenous people that sort of inhabited the kind of Bogota area, like what you now call Bogota, which is of course where Olga Amaral is from, at the time of the Spanish conquest. This particular piece is a votive piece, which means a piece that is made to sort of like be given as an offering in a sacred site, and without the intention of sort of like getting it back, right? And so this piece depicts a very sort of like, I guess I'm going to use this word, iconic ritual that was important for the Muisca, in which an indigenous chief would sail to the middle of a lagoon, the Lake Guatavita, which was a sacred site for the Muisca, covered in gold leaf, and he would submerge himself into the waters. And while he would do that, he would also sort of bring all these gold pieces as offerings. So in a way, this is a kind of meta piece because it sort of depicts the very ritual that it is meant to do. And this particular piece, along with a lot of sort of Muisca gold pieces, have become really an important part of the sort of Colombian material culture vernacular, something that Olga Amaral was really interested in engaging it. But at the same time, she was looking at these sort of very colonial material culture pieces that are also used for religious purposes. This one here is a retablo from the 18th century. Of course, it's very well known that, you know, Latin American countries, particularly around the area of Colombia, were sort of heavily mined for their precious gold. And a lot of that gold was used for religious offerings or for religious pieces that would also sort of serve the purpose of trying to convert the local population. And so Olga Amaral is very much interested, not necessarily from a sort of like critical conceptual perspective, but more so from a sort of material perspective, into these sort of like religious objects and how they might sort of create the sense of awe in the spectator, which when you do go to the galleries, for those of you who haven't gone into, you will kind of see that she tries to do the same in her beautiful pieces. And this next piece, however, it's an earlier piece, and we wanted to highlight the fact that, you know, if a lot of you might be very familiar with the work of de Amaral, and when people think of de Amaral, they very often think of her use of gold leaf. But what's interesting about it is that she really began to use gold in the 80s and continues to use it to this day. But before the 80s, she was very interested in sort of like highlighting the sculptural aspect of textile through the use of organic materials that were very local to her environment. And her environment has always been the sort of Bogota savanna. And so this particular piece called Entorno Quieto, I'll speak a little bit more about it, but it was sort of created in 1993. It's actually the very last piece that she created using horse fiber and wool, which was a sort of like very, very sort of a material in heavy rotation in her repertoire before the 1990s. And the reason why she was interested in this particular material was because when she was formed as a textile artist in the Cranbrook Academy in Michigan, where she studied under Marianne Strangel, who was a sort of modernist designer who very much encouraged her to look at the kind of architectural aspects of textile. And she really very much did that. But when she returned to Colombia, she not only was interested in sort of like exploring the architectural and spatial aspects of textiles, but she really wanted to highlight their sculptural aspect through a very, very local vernacular. A lot of textile and fiber artists at the time were looking at sort of pre-Columbian references for their inspiration. These were international artists that were sort of like working in the realm of fiber art. But she wasn't necessarily very interested in looking at pre-Columbian references. Instead, she was very interested in looking at sort of contemporary rural references that she saw every day in her sort of life in Colombia. And so she realized that the use of wool and horsehair, which is a very distinct material, it's a sort of very rough and hard material, but at the same time, of course, very sturdy, was used by campesino communities in the Boyacá region of Colombia to make ruanas, which is a sort of very rural poncho that is still used to this day in Colombia, but also to make basketry. And so this piece, it sort of highlights both this sort of like this root in the Colombian vernacular, but it also speaks to her interest in sort of creating textiles that allow for people, like that sort of like highlight the architectural aspect of a piece. And so once you go see it in the gallery, you'll see that the piece really sort of forces you to question the way in which you exist in the space with the piece. You have to move around with it. It's actually made of 284 strips of wool, hand-spun wool and horsehair. Each one is sort of like individually woven and then hung from a metal rod. I'm gonna go into this sort of close-up so that you can get a better sense. And once these strips are woven and hung, you can see that she sort of like places very careful consideration into the spacing of between each, I guess, woven piece to create a really, really sort of magical light effect that, again, we really encourage you to go down and see it because it's really one of her most special pieces.
I think this piece reflects a lot about Olga Amaral's, also her training as an architectural designer as well, and it is very much about space and light, and as Anna said, controlling your experience of the space. But it does have a kind of magical quality to it, and again, we encourage you to go. We didn't put a video in because we want you to see it for yourself. But she is very, with these kind of modest materials and the kind of control, and there is this kind of tension between these rough, stiff materials and the kind of precision that it took for her to create the effect that you see when you see this piece in person. We just can't stop talking about it.
We're obsessed.
are.
It's really beautiful. And it's really not one of the pieces that you sort of like see in art fairs or in exhibitions about her work. It's sort of like a quiet and at the same time completely magical piece. So we're really, I'm just so happy that Melinda acquired it for the collection. Should I keep going?
Yes, please.
Okay, and so from there, as Melinda said, we thought it would be really interesting as we've been having these conversations about sort of identity through craft practices around textiles to bring in a few works that are perhaps not in the exhibition, but are part of our architecture and design collection or our textile collection that enter into really interesting dialogue with the pieces that you will see in the exhibition. This particular piece is also a recent acquisition by an artist called Jorge González, who is from Puerto Rico, who is very interested in sort of establishing. He has a very socially engaged practice that is interested in kind of the recuperation of Boricua material culture, seeking to create new narratives between the indigenous and the modern. In 2014, Jorge González established Escuela de Oficios, which translates to trade school in English, which is technically an itinerant school of craft centered on collective learning that aims to counter the exclusion of indigenous knowledge practices, both in academic and art spaces, both on the island and abroad. And so through pedagogy, through mapping, through documentation, he engages with artisanal teaching techniques to develop a sort of network of collaborators that are, craft makers, educators, and anybody that seeks to learn in Puerto Rico. But what's interesting about his practice, and particularly the sort of very beginning of his practice, is that he himself was kind of interested in connecting with his own Boricua identity, and particularly his own Taíno identity. As a lot of you may know, in Puerto Rico, there's the mainstream discourse around indigeneity is that the Taíno people, who were the, indigenous group that inhabited the island at the time of conquest, were sort of like eradicated. There are no indigenous groups anymore. But the reality is that a large percent of the population in Puerto Rico still holds indigenous DNA. And there are a lot of efforts to sort of like reconnect with those lineages. And for Jorge González in particular, those lineages exist in the sort of like craft practices that have, been important for the island and for the material culture of the island for, centuries. And he's doing so from a very personal perspective, but also as a way to sort of like, again, reconnect those sort of like local indigenous lineages with the sort of modernist histories that have dominated sort of material culture and art history around Puerto Rico for many, many years. So when he was a very young artist, he worked as a gardener in Casa Clum, which you can see here, which was sort of like the one-time residence and architectural manifesto of Henry Klum, a German-born architect who moved to Puerto Rico in the middle of the 20th century and became one of the sort of proponents for what is very often called tropical modernism. The house is really interesting in the sense that it's sort of like a one-story house that has very little separation between the outside and the inside, which is of course a feature of tropical modernism. But for Henry Klum, it was also an important way to sort of connect with his neighbors, to connect with craft makers that would come in and collaborate with him on the house, and to connect with his gardener as well. And so Jorge González was inspired by this sort of collaborative aspect of this very modernist house, but at the same time, a house that had been inspired by the craft practices of the time, to develop Escuela de Oficios as a sort of communal place for gathering and for sharing knowledge. And so the piece that we acquired for the collection, I'll go back really quickly so that you can see it again, is this chair called After Arclu, in which Jorge González sort of takes inspiration from a line of very modernist furniture that Henry Klum designed called Arclu. But he recreates it using some of the very local techniques of entail weaving that are important for the island. If we please could play the video. Thank you. Entail translates to cattail in English. I have also heard that in the Midwest they call it sausage tail. So somebody please confirm or deny that that's the case.
I grew up in Ohio and they were cattails, so I don't know if anybody.
Okay. I've heard it though. Entail is sort of like a collaborator for Jorge, not only because it's a sort of very important material for the craft practices in Puerto Rico currently, but also was heavily used by the Taino at the time. And it's a very sort of flexible and sort of very, it has a lot of different properties. It can be plaited, it can be knotted, etc. This particular technique is developed by the Villalobos family in Cieles in Puerto Rico, and it's basically, he calls it, I'll talk about this a little bit later, he calls it a weaving technique, but it's really a sort of knotting and wrapping technique that allows the artisans to both sort of, to wrap the entail around a piece of furniture. So you've already seen the chair. But I wanted to end with this video and to sort of highlight the fact that in Spanish, for example, the word tejer applies to a lot of different fiber-based methodologies. So when you're knitting with needles, we call that tejer. But when you're weaving, we also call that tejer. And so we also wanted to highlight the sort of like broad approaches to weaving that are also addressed in the exhibition. And as you sort of traverse through the space, we really kind of encourage you to think about weaving in different ways, not just a sort of like classic loom weaving that is still so important for all of these artists, but a lot of them are sort of like pushing beyond those technologies.
Yeah, absolutely. In thinking about putting the show together, I did think about the practices of weaving and all of the different kinds of fiber techniques that are represented in our collection and that are represented by people working with fiber. And I did decide to narrow down to practices that can be considered sort of traditional loom weaving. So there is a mechanism that is a loom of a great variety of looms. We've already talked about different types, but that these are fiber works made on a loom. So it is very much pieces that could be called weavings, but that, as Anna has pointed out, weaving is a word that doesn't mean the same in every language and can have many, many different results. So I want to highlight the work of two American artists who are represented in the exhibition. James Bassler, who is based in Southern California, and Ethel Stein, who was based just north of New York City. Again, these are, as I mentioned, Ethel Stein was really called a weaver's weaver. James Bassler is someone who has spent his career both as an artist, but also as a really influential educator. And so as an educator, he's extremely knowledgeable about a great variety of techniques because he needs to pass this knowledge on to his students who are studying textile histories and textile making, but he has also activated these techniques in his own practice. So James Bassler's A Weaving is the work that greets you when you come into the exhibition. And again, I think we can call this a kind of meta project as well. What Bassler's doing is he's really kind of illustrating, he's using one technique and he is illustrating another technique and tradition. So he's illustrating the for-selvage weaving, which is a type of weaving that is, and a weaving strategy that is present both in pre-Columbian Peruvian weaving, but also in Diné weaving, in Navajo weaving, and if you look at the picture of a weaving here, you can see that on all four sides, you're seeing a finished edge where the threads are turning around. There's no cut edge. So he's illustrated that, but he's actually woven it on a regular floor loom that does have a beginning and an end. So it's not a kind of infinite loop. But the technique that he's used to make this is a technique that is used in Diné weaving, which is called wedge weaving. And I have this little kind of diagram for you, showing what wedge weaving is really a deflection of the warps and wefts off of the vertical and the horizontal and onto angles that serve the weaver's purposes. So he has used that both in the kind of candy stripes that you see of this sort of giant overblown thread that is the illustration of for-selvage weaving, but also in the background where he's using traditional indigo dyeing, and you can see this kind of subtle shift of angles from one side to another. So this is a really kind of meta work where he has really been able to express his knowledge and his reverence for two very different weaving traditions in one piece. Next, I'll just talk briefly about Ethel Stein. Again, she was really one of the foremost weavers, but kind of an insider in the weaving and artistic community. Someone who didn't spend a lot of time promoting herself. She made her own looms. She practiced every single textile technique you could possibly imagine. She also studied very deeply and for over a long period of time the collections of the Cooper Hewitt Museum with then research curator Milton Sonde, who is really considered one of the foremost technical structural analysis experts in the United States. And what they studied was damask weaving, which in this picture here, this banner, this sort of double banner that Ethel Stein has woven called Buta, you don't really appreciate the structure because the color has really kind of overtaken it. But when you do see it in the galleries, you can appreciate this satin damask structure where you have the two faces of a single technique. But she's also activated and really kind of made this witty play on the ikat technique, the warp dyeing technique, and also the ubiquitous global textile motif of what we call a paisley, but in India and in most of the Eastern Hemisphere is called a butta. So you can see, hopefully, this is these very clever kind of interlocking paisleys that she's made into this big two-piece banner. Stein's inspiration was an actual Central Asian ikat, perhaps this piece from Uzbekistan, though it was definitely a piece in the Textile Museum collection in Washington, D.C. She was commissioned to make butta for an exhibition that was where all of the artists participating were asked to use works in the Textile Museum's collection and create something. And so again, I think Stein has really, I'll just go back quickly. I think Stein has created something that is both recognizable and as a traditional technique and completely modern. And I will say there is an exhibition on ikat at the Textile Museum, which just opened last week, I think the same day as Threaded Visions opened. So we're all looking forward to going out to DC. Moving into the last section of the exhibition, which again I spoke about being a section about mechanical patterning and the jacquard loom, I just quickly want to point out the work of Leah Cook, who is another American artist who is really interested. She's had a long hand weaving practice, but she has started, in the last couple of decades, has also started to use a mechanical patterning technique, but continue to do hand weaving. So she's able to make these very complicated pictures, one of which you see here called Facing Touch from 2011. What she's illustrating and what she's able to do in her hand weaving practice using a technology is to illustrate also her collaboration and her interest in neuroscience. She started to work with scientists to explore the effects, the haptic effects of touch versus the visual effects of how the brain perceives a particular picture. How does the brain perceive and react to a picture of a face versus how does the brain perceive and react to touching a picture of a face? So this is what's illustrated in her weaving here, Facing Touch. And here you can see a close-up of the work, a kind of a detail of the work, which is both very pictorial and also really kind of communicates this sort of pixelated digital type effect. So I'm going to pass it back to Anna now, who's going to talk about a couple more works in the collection and in the exhibition, which take this mechanical weaving really to its most contemporary expression.
Thank you. Yes, before I sort of jump into the very last work from the show that we wanted to highlight, I just really quickly wanted to highlight another piece from the architecture and design collection that also sort of like engages with textiles as a way to depict a scientific image or a scientific process. But in this particular case, it uses textiles also as a way to question narratives around architecture and the built environment. This piece is by ADWO, which is an architecture firm led by Emmanuel Atmasu, who is from Ethiopia, and Jen Wood, who's from Australia, but they're both based in the US. And the piece was actually commissioned by the Museum of Modern Art for an exhibition called Reconstructions, Blackness and Architecture in America. For this particular piece, ADWO, or Atmasu and Wood, were particularly interested in sort of addressing the pervasive systems of displacement and containment that impinge upon Black life from the transatlantic floor to Atlanta, which was the city that they really focused on for this particular project. But what's really interesting about this textile is that it also speaks to the sort of like liminality of identity for Emmanuel Atmasu in particular. He was particularly interested in the sort of inseparability of the Atlantic Ridge, which is what this this textile depicts is an actual geographic map of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which is a sort of canyon formation in the bottom of the floor that sort of lies right in the middle of Africa and the US, and is basically it's a symbol of the sort of violent displacement, or this journey of displacement that our African slaves had to sort of traverse in their journey from Africa to the US. But it was also a sort of very personal journey of immigration for Emmanuel, who had to immigrate from Ethiopia into Atlanta when he was a teenager. And so this piece in particular is sort of made of two different ridges, one horizontal and one vertical. The vertical ridge, as I mentioned, is a textile, whereas the horizontal ridge is a sort of urban map of Atlanta that highlights some of the architectural aspects that are key for Black life in the city. So instead of sort of like the regular buildings that you might think about when you think about architecture, it highlights the Waffle House, it highlights the highway, sorry, my English sometimes leaves me. The highway, and again, as a way to sort of question ideas around architecture and the way in which architecture is informed by anti-Blackness in the US. And so the textile, they chose textile in particular because it was a really interesting way to sort of navigate the 2D and 3D elements. But what is really interesting here is that they created this sort of like very personal image as a digital file that then was sent to a textile manufacturer in Flanders that then created it. So in this case, his sort of exploration, very intimate exploration of identity, doesn't necessarily come from this sort of like engagement in materials and processes, as was the case with most of the artists that we've been talking about, but instead it sort of comes with this sort of very personal process of image making, and it also comes from this sort of globalized journey that the textile is making from Brussels to the US, starting in Africa as well. And of course, they've chosen cotton as their material as a way to, of course, comment on the way in which these particular textile practices also influence the sort of very violent histories of colonialism and forced labor that exists, that informs the development of Atlanta as a city as well. And so with that, sorry, I spoke really quickly, but I wanted to make sure that we had time to speak about Qualisha Wood, who is also an artist that is very interested in sort of like the relationship between image making and textile, and also the liminality of textile, in this case as sort of a medium that very easily moves between the private and the public sphere. She created this work, which is from 2023, and as Melinda mentioned, is a recent acquisition, after she had been doxxed, which basically means that her private information was shared on the internet for malicious intent. She, from a very young age, has been really active online. She actually infiltrated a sort of like she hacked into a right-wing group and replaced their profile picture with a photo of Michelle Obama. And after doing that, she then got doxxed. And so she creates this really beautiful textile pieces that were inspired by the blankets that she saw in her grandmother's house that had photos of herself and her brothers and her cousins. And she thought they would be a really interesting medium to explore this sort of like very, very fraught way in which her own identity as a Black woman is both completely intimate to her, but also gets very easily, taken up for public consumption, especially as a person who is like very often online. And so, as I think Melinda already mentioned, she sort of creates these digital files that are made with, that are sort of a collage of selfies, but also other kind of digital imagery of comments that she's received in her process of being doxxed. And then she sort of shifts it into a textile manufacturer that uses digital jacquard weaving. And she creates really beautiful pieces. But what's also really interesting is that she, after the piece has sort of come back, she adds in one single sort of halo of hand embroidered beads. And so again, she sort of like, it's an interesting comment about the sort of like liminality between the digital and the handmade, but also between the private and the public. She's sort of like using her own image as a way to sort of like both regain sort of like regain power over it, but understanding that it's something that gets circulated freely in the world, as textiles very often do. So we thought that was a really wonderful way to kind of end our chat.
Yeah. Thank you very much. We're so excited about Qualisha's work, and I had the opportunity to speak to her and really try to understand her practice a bit better as well. And she was absolutely 100% deeply knowledgeable about textile techniques, and she deliberately chose this technique. She's done a lot of printmaking, she's studied photography, but she deliberately chose this weaving technique. And as Anna and I were discussing the other day, she's chosen this way to make a picture out of weaving, but it's also a blanket that could, it is functionally potentially a blanket that could envelop you in a kind of intimate moment. So as you're talking about the kind of public-private nature of her work, and also the kind of intimacy and ubiquity of textiles, this is something that we are constantly thinking about in the museum world. So with that, we've thrown a lot of information and ideas at you, and it's been our great pleasure to do so. I've got some names on the screen here. I want to thank my colleagues in the textiles department and my colleagues in conservation, and the designers who worked on the show, editors, interpretation staff who've worked on the show, everyone has played an essential role in making the exhibition what you will see in the galleries. There are so many details that were driven by people other than myself. So I want to, again, express my thanks to everyone, and apologies if I've forgotten anyone who also spent weeks working on this show. I want to thank Anna again, and I just want to end by giving you some more very exciting news. Maria Davila and Eduardo Portillo will be here to give an artist talk on April 11th. They will be talking, they've titled it Weaving a World, and it's going to be an amazing opportunity to hear more from these artists who, as I said, inspired me to do this show and have inspired so many people, and I really look forward to the opportunity to bring them to a greater audience. So thank you for being in our audience today. And we may have time for a couple of questions.
Yeah, we have time for about 2 questions.
Okay, for about 2 questions. So if you have questions, our colleagues Mel and Miguel are there with microphones, and if you could use the microphone so everyone can hear you. If you have a question, that would be terrific.
I have a question back here, over here. Okay, are you sure? Okay, never mind.
We're going to have to rely on Mel and Miguel if there are any questions, because we can't really see.
Meg, I think on your side there's somebody.
The exhibit makes reference to the mechanical loom being the precursor to computers.
Yes.
But who invented the mechanical loom?
So that's still in my notes that I forgot to mention. So a French inventor called Joseph-Marie Jacquard invented basically the punch card system, which you'll be familiar if you know anything about computing in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. The punch card system that he invented was a way of giving instructions. So basically a yes or a no. So you've got a punch card, there's a hole, or there's a solid space. And the control on the loom would either go through the hole or not. And that instruction then was transferred through a number of other threads and mechanisms to either lift a thread or leave it in position, which would control individually the interlace of the threads. If you look at the books on the history of computing, if you ask anybody about the history of computing, they will refer you to Joseph-Marie Jacquard. And the invention was really kind of finalized in about 1804 and adopted really in the next couple decades, pretty much globally.
And do we have a question up in the front here?
I have really more a comment than a question, and I may just be totally out of whack on this, but Coletta Wood's work, when I first saw it, it reminded me of Faith Ringgold. And I thought, she was taking ownership of her own story, and she was creating power for herself that way. And I thought that she was using the textile medium as a way also to embrace and own the African American culture and the role of women in that. And am I from Mars, or do you see any of this as well?
No, you're totally right. And actually, there's she tells this story, if you're interested, that she began her journey as a sort of an artist at RISD as an illustrator. She was thinking that she was going to make children's books, and then she sort of started wondering whether she should shift to printmaking, as Melinda mentioned. And what prompted her to actually make the switch was actually meeting Faith Ringgold, and Faith Ringgold told her, you should do what you need to do. So she's a very big inspiration, and also the reason why she's making the type of work that she is making.
Yeah, I completely agree as well. And I also, Faith Ringgold really opened doors for so many people in her struggles to have working in fiber embraced as art, really opened the doors for successors, for the next generation, for Bisa Butler, for Geo Swaby, both of whom we've had the privilege of working with and exhibiting here. And if you read Bisa's comments, if you read what Geo has to say, they embrace their work in fiber immediately, because I think that it's an oversimplification, but Faith Ringgold helped to give them the opportunity to do that. She broke ground and said, fiber is a medium with which to express yourself in the art world. So yes. Thank you all again very much.